Hi everybody, welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. I am now back from Utah. I was there for a week and boy was it busy. I recorded so many videos for my new channel called Explore Church Sites, including this one at the conference center. If you haven't subscribed, please make sure to do so now. These are fascinating videos. I think that you'll enjoy them, especially if you can't make it to the sites in Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, and now Utah. This is one of my favorite videos that I took while I was there at the conference center. It was just amazing. And let me tell you something. There was only one day that entire time that I got 8 hours of sleep. It was just go, go, go. And especially with what happened recently with President Nelson. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. Is this is obviously going to be a really big general conference. But it's not just because of the passing of President Nelson, which is pretty significant by itself. But there's been this like series of events leading up to this moment, it seems. Events that, you know, up until maybe today, I was thinking mostly of like what's been going on in September. But it actually kind of stretches, the way that I see it, it kind of stretches into earlier this year. And we've talked about a few of these things, but I want to do a quick recap and then just think about the implications of what's going on right now. By the way, all these videos are going to be released over the course of this next month. I'm going to publish the first one tonight, the first video that I made in Utah, but these will be out, you know, in the process of time. So make sure to look out for these videos. I was able to go to a lot of temples, a lot of church sites, and even if you're in Utah, some of the places that I recorded may be places that you haven't been to before. Maybe you've only been once. Maybe you've never paid attention to the signs and the plaques or thought about the history of that place. So make sure to check this out. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out, earlier this year, I'm not exactly sure when, but I was talking to my friend Jessica with Christ Pearls in Utah. She was the one that told me about this. Now, I don't care to get into like really the controversy. I just want to point out that you had this person here, Julie Hanks, that I guess for a long time, I haven't really followed this story. It's not really my thing. But my friend Rachel with Women in Priesthood, she's told me all about it. But essentially, you've had this figure that I guess for a long time, she's kind of been helping people leave the church. And, you know, I don't know her exact motives, but it seems like that's the case. That essentially she hasn't necessarily been like a force for good in the church from what I can tell. And just recently, within the last couple of months, I think, she has left the church. And I think what happened with this is that this was a dividing moment. And that's going to be the theme of all these different events that I point out in this presentation, is like we've had a bunch of dividing moments. It seems like she was helping people leave the church, and then she herself left the church. And I'm sure that people that are big fans of her, that are maybe still in the church, maybe some of them have also left. So it was like this dividing moment. I'll put a link for this video in the description box below, but make sure to subscribe to Rachel, Women in Priesthood. Her voice is needed now more than ever. And along those same lines, you know, I moved to Independence earlier this year, and just like a week or two after moving here, this story came out. This is the Salt Lake Tribune. You have Valerie and Nathan Hamaker, and they're from Kansas City, and they were essentially doing the same things. I think they were friends with Julie Hanks. It's been a while since I looked at this story, and I don't really want to focus on it too much here, but this is a similar thing where you have this kind of like divide, this like division. They already had this podcast that was, it seems like it was mostly antagonistic toward the church and talking about their quote unquote struggles in the church. And then they finally stepped away because they were having issues with their priesthood leaders, with all the content that they were creating. So again, this was another like division, at least, you know, I'm sure that some of their followers probably followed them out of the church. I don't know that for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. Now, fast forward to September, and the Wall Street Journal decided to publish this article: Exmo influencers mount a TikTok war against the Mormon Church. And of course, it's not just on TikTok, it's across all of social media. And they highlight Alyssa Grenfell, which is kind of the leader of the pack, from what I can tell. And it was just a very disrespectful article toward the church, and mostly focused on the anti, point of view. They did, I think, I want to say that they interviewed Jasmine Rapley. I'm not going to pay to read this article, but I know that Jasmine was in here. But it was mostly negative toward the church. So this was on September 2nd. And then we had this from Time Magazine. And this was an article that was penned by President Nelson himself. This came out just a few days later, September 5th. But there was just this interesting thing that happened between the Wall Street Journal that was mostly against the church, and then this one, Time Magazine. So it's like another divide, another thing that a large audience saw. Okay, and then President Nelson celebrated his 101st birthday on September 9th. And then we all know what happened the day after that. Of all places, it happened in Utah Valley, the day after President Nelson passed away. And this was obviously a divisive event. You'd think that it would unify. You'd think that people that are rational, loving, compassionate, would not be, that everyone would just come together and be against extremism. But it seems that this further divided and made people even more extreme. Okay, and then not too long after that, President Nelson passed away. Before I move on to what happened after that, let me just point out a few things. And we've talked about this on the channel a number of times, but I just want to highlight this email from Kira Dahl. Subject line, President Nelson. Hi, Jared. Not sure if you've made this connection yet. I'm sure you have, but it dawned on me today that President Nelson served as the prophet for 7 years. 7 equals completion. President Nelson has warned us for 7 years about the second coming of Jesus Christ. Thanks for all you do. And yes, Kara, we've talked about that many times. There have been many sevens that we've noticed during President Nelson's presidency that it seems that he was intentionally doing. It really seems that he did a lot of things in sevens. Whether it was his first batch of temple announcements, which there were 7 temples announced that first general conference, or going to the 7 countries outside of the United States that first year that he did his global ministry tour, and many, many, many other things. And so 7, the number 7 and President Nelson seem to go together, including his entire presidency. He hit his 7-year anniversary earlier this year on January 14th, which is a multiple of 7. And yeah, I think that that's significant. And then, sorry, we're gonna go back to the whole divide. But we need to take a pause right here. And then I got this email from Marcy Giles. Subject line, Vayelech, meaning for President Nelson's last day. So I read this during a live stream, but I'm going to share it here too. This comes from the weekly Torah portion that Jews worldwide read from. It's kind of like their version of Come Follow Me. Here's the schedule right here. This is on kabod.org. And when you get to Sabbath this year, September 27th, the portion is called Vayelech. And that portion, which is so interesting, especially since we've talked about this story and how it could be a foreshadowing of President Nelson and President Oaks. So this comes from Deuteronomy 31 verses 1 through 30. Describes Moses' final days as he appoints Joshua as his successor. You guys, Jews worldwide were reading this on the day that President Nelson passed away, which, by the way, was the 27th. Just another 7. The 27th. Moses' final days, as he appoints Joshua as his successor, instructs the people on the Hakel commandment, a periodic public Torah reading, interestingly. Just like how it was during President Nelson's presidency that Come Follow Me came into being, and prepares for his own death. The parasha also includes God's prophecy that the Israelites will stray from the covenant and Moses' creation of a prophetic song to serve as a witness against them. Key aspects of the Vayelech parasha: transition of leadership. Moses at 120 years old, which is really old for any period of time, except for maybe back during the time during Adam and Eve and the patriarchs. Moses at 120 years old declares he can no longer lead the people and designates Joshua as the new leader. Yeah, I guess this is kind of a repeat. We've talked about this idea on the channel a number of times, how, President Nelson, President Oaks, relatively speaking, relative to the rest of this dispensation, they're pretty old. In fact, we've never had an older prophet or apostle in this dispensation, other than aside from President Nelson. He's been the oldest. And I'm not going to pull up the spreadsheet right now, but we actually had the oldest first presidency and president of the Quorum of the 12. Back before President M. Russell Ballard passed away, all members of the first presidency, as well as President Ballard, they were all in their 90s. That had never happened before. And this was one of the interesting characteristics of Israel before they entered the Promised Land, which I think is a foreshadowing of us moving into the millennium, our Promised Land, inheriting the earth. You had these old leaders. You had Moses, you had Joshua, and you had Caleb. They were the only 3 who had actually lived in Egypt and survived the entire 40 years. All the rest of that generation passed away. It was only the new generation that moved into the millennium. In the case of Moses, he led Israel all the way up to the millennium, but he didn't enter the Promised Land. Moses led Israel all the way up to the Promised Land, but he did not enter it himself. It was Joshua that led Israel. And this is the first time that you see 7 trumpets in the scriptures, is in the story of Jericho, which I think itself is a small foreshadowing of the fall of the world, the fall of the kingdoms of the world, and the righteous inheriting the earth. So, I was thinking that President Nelson would probably live until the millennium, and as soon as the millennium started, he would be the first one to be changed in the twinkling of an eye from mortality to resurrection, but that's not the case. But I feel like this still holds true. He didn't actually live to the millennium. He didn't see the millennium. Maybe this is even more perfect if this is a foreshadowing. So is President Oaks going to be the one to take us in? We'll have to see. We'll have to see. But the day that President Nelson passed away, Jews worldwide were reading this story of all stories. Okay. So President Nelson passes away, and then the next day, this happens. Again, divide. So you see, it's just thing after thing. Divide, 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 and then divide. And now we're going to have President Oaks, and President Oaks himself is probably going to be a big divider. We've talked about the symbolism, if it is a thing, and I think it is, that President Nelson, President Oaks, they were called at the same time to the apostleship. Now they've both been in the first presidency, and it looks like now both of them will have been presidents of the church. President Nelson, in his life before becoming an apostle, he was a heart surgeon. And it seems that he worked on the hearts of the membership of the church to make them Zion, of one heart and one mind, and pure in heart. Well, President Oaks, he was a judge. And so I think that there's going to be some division coming. I think there's going to be sifting. I feel like there's been a lot of sifting and sorting of wheat and tares through all these events that have taken place this year. Not just this year, but it feels like it's reached a new phase this year with the sifting. And it's interesting when you think about the fact, and I've always thought about this ever since I started this channel. President Oak's big second coming talk was all the way back in April 2004. I was on my mission at the time. Oh, no, wait. This was just a little bit before I left. I left just like a couple weeks later. He gave his big second coming talk, a talk the likes of which I haven't seen, because he gives this numbered list of these are the signs of the times to look for. Somewhere here in the talk, he references tsunamis, or in other words, the waves of the sea heaving. Yeah, the waves of the sea heaving themselves beyond their bounds, which is really interesting because the day after Christmas, 2004, that's when there was that huge earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia that killed over 200,000 people. President Oakes earlier that year specifically referenced that scripture that talks about the sea heaving themselves beyond their bounds. Another thing that stuck out in this talk is this part right here. He talks about the parable of the 10 virgins, and he says the arithmetic of this parable is chilling. The 10 virgins obviously represent members of Christ's church, for all were invited to the wedding feast and all knew what was required to be admitted when the bridegroom came, but only half were ready when he came. He reiterated this again recently. It was within the last couple general conferences, but I thought this was interesting because he seems to be saying that this is an actual number. It's an actual percentage. It seems that maybe literally half of the church will be ready and half will not. It's not just like, oh yeah, some will be ready and some won't. No, it seems like it's going to be a large portion, literally half. He's repeated it 2 times, but this is the first time that he said it that I know of. So I've said on the channel that this talk is probably going to become that much more interesting and significant if President Oakes becomes president of the church. And he's about to. He's about to be sustained. My understanding is that he will be sustained as president of the church tomorrow. There's been some people that think that no, that President Nelson's funeral has to take place first, but I don't think so. Not from what I've heard, but we'll see. So April 2004, his big second coming talk. I think it's interesting that it's 20 years before President Nelson gave his big second coming talk. I'm not aware of a larger or more focused second coming talk of President Nelson other than this one in October 2024. The Lord Jesus Christ will come again. So 20 is just one of those interesting round numbers. I don't know if there's anything to it, but 20 years apart. And then, so as far as like the last divisive event, being President Oakes himself becoming president of the church, this is also something we've talked about for a long time. You know that there are certain people in the church that don't like him because of his, I guess, his judicial background, and he's a little bit more politically minded, it seems. And it seems like he's coming at just the right time. I have no doubt that the timing is right. Again, one other thing to point out is, before we move on from President Nelson, it's so interesting that he passed away exactly 1 week before General Conference. I don't think that that's coincidence. I think that there are going to be so many eyes on this General Conference, and there should be. Especially with President Oakes becoming president of the church, I think he's going to be a very significant president of the church. Just because of everything that we said, this whole potential foreshadowing of Moses and Joshua leading the church into the Israelites into the promised land. Okay, this is Associated Press. Former judge is likely the next leader of the Mormon church and its 17 million members, which is actually closer to 18 million at this point. Salt Lake City. Down H. Oaks, a former Utah Supreme Court justice known for his jurist sensibilities and traditionalist convictions on marriage and religious freedom, is expected to be the next president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its more than 17 million members worldwide. And then this article, I'm not going to read it just because YouTube things, but just read this right here. This article notes the unusual events and circumstances that have preceded the calling or the sustaining of President Oaks. Really interesting. So it's not just us here on Second Coming channels or people in your ward. At a national level, this set of circumstances is being pointed out. Okay, later on, there's some quotes here from Matthew Bowman, a Claremont graduate university professor specializing in U.S. religious history. Just want to point that out because he has a couple things to say. This section is called Experts Skeptical on Oaks Presidency Will Bring Major Change. Quote, I suspect that Oaks has had a fairly strong hand in leadership through Nelson's presidency, Bowman said. I think we're not going to see a very tremendous pivot. And yeah, I think that could be right in some ways. But I could see certain things happening during President, like maybe some like milestone changes in the church, or President Oaks may choose to focus on certain things. But it may not be that dramatic. Sorry, that's kind of ambiguous what I'm saying. I kind of agree, but I kind of don't. I guess we'll see what happens. Oaks may refocus on the U.S. and its politics, Bowman said. Yeah. And then in the next section is, in Oaks' presidency creates anxiety for LGBTQ plus members and allies. Yeah, this is really what's been on my mind whenever I've thought about President Oaks. Mostly them, but then just, secular people overall. It says Oaks has been a driving force against same-sex marriage and in upholding a teaching that homosexuality is a sin, creating anxiety and concern among the faithful who are gay, lesbian, and transgender. He often delivered speeches reinforcing the faith's stance, including one in which he said the intended meaning for quote-unquote gender in church doctrine is quote-unquote biological sex at birth. Church policies introduced in 2024 significantly restricted involvement of members who had transitioned physically or socially, such as changing their name or pronouns. It goes on to talk about more things, but I want to skip down. Noah Hansen. Now, here's just like one example of what may happen, it may or may not happen, but I think that this illustrates what some people are worried about. Noah Hansen, who is gay and grew up in the religion, worries Oaks' ascension will drive a greater wedge between LGBTQ plus people and their devout family members. Under Nelson, the church largely backed off talking about homosexuality, Hansen said, giving his parents the space to, quote-unquote, make a little progress. They've started telling my husband that they love him, said the 27-year-old from Logan, Utah. If Oaks is outspoken about LGBTQ plus people, as he has been in the past, Hansen worries that progress will slip. His parents revered church presidents who are considered prophets by members, even if their policies are harmful to their own children, he said. Well, let me just push back on that. I don't think that there's going to be like suddenly this change where it's like, oh, you know what? Now that President Oaks is president of the church, we're not going to say we love you anymore. That just doesn't, I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen. Quote, If Down H. Oaks doesn't soften his stances on how marriage is only between a man and a woman, or that the act of homosexuality is a sin, like if he lays down that hammer, I feel that's going to ruin my relationship with my parents, Hansen said. So, I mean, he's basically saying that he thinks that his parents are like robots, that they just follow orders, and it's like, oh, now we can't love our son anymore. We need to distance ourselves. I don't think so. Sorry, I think that's wrong. Of course, I mean, maybe some people will be like that, but generally speaking, I don't think that's going to be the case. Oak's presidency could be stylistically different. That's the next section. Well known for dry sermons and speeches that appeal more to reason than emotion, Oakes brings a jurist sensibility to his work. Yeah, he's the judge. Compared to Nelson's sentimentalism, Oakes is cooler, more precise, and lawyerly, Bowman said. Becoming president, though, could inspire him to adopt a more personal approach, suggested Patrick Mason, a religious studies and history professor at Utah State University. Quote, "It's a very different thing to be president of the church and to recognize that now you are meant to be all things to all people within the church," Mason said. I disagree with that because it's already really, really significant for you. And you probably already get this sense once you become a general authority in general. I don't think that there's going to be like a major, like he's going to be like, oh, wow, now I'm the man. And being first counselor in the first presidency, you're just one step away from it. I don't think that becoming president of the church would like suddenly change you in the way that he's saying. Oakes has been outspoken about maintaining civil public discourse, urging people shortly before the 2024 presidential election to, quote unquote, avoid what is harsh and hateful and be peacemakers in their communities. Okay, and then the article talks about this that happened right here. And then Bowman says, that really, I think, alarmed Nelson and it alarmed Oakes. I think this is back on Oakes' radar that political extremism in the church is a problem. And he may be, I think, because of his training and because of his background, perhaps more willing than Nelson to take concrete steps. Well, and again, this person's, looking at this from a secular point of view. From our point of view, we know that the Lord is in charge. It's the Lord that directs this church. And yes, they do have to do their own problem solving and counsel together. It's the same with us. We don't just like go to the Lord and ask the Lord what we should do without thinking about things first. And sometimes the Lord allows us to make mistakes so that we can learn. So that part of it is true, but ultimately the Lord is in control. And I think some people, they struggle when you have different presidents of the church because they look at them more as men rather than prophets that are receiving revelation. And I think that we have to look at it like this. It's like when you're building a house, you have different tools, right? You have different tools. You can't build a house only using screwdrivers. There are some tools that are gentler than others, but all of them are necessary. So sometimes you need screwdrivers, and screwdrivers, they're not as violent as hammers, but they're all necessary. And so I think the Lord, he prepares his different prophets. They have their different specialties and training and ways in which they're trained and professions that they have before becoming president of the church to prepare them for a specific need at a specific time. And it makes me think back to my singles ward. We had this one bishop, the first one that I had when I joined the singles ward, where he was pretty easygoing. And in singles wards, you have a lot of people that they mess up with things and they have to go see the bishop. And with this first bishop, my understanding is that he was pretty easygoing and whatever. But his time was up after a while, and we got a new bishop, and he was much more strict. And he wanted to see more. He wanted quicker progress. And some people were complaining about that. And my thought was, well, there probably was a time when the bishop could go easier on you as you're going through the repentance process, but it can't be like that forever. Maybe the Lord felt like, okay, they've been given a chance and I've given them leniency and all this stuff, but now we need to get serious about this. You're still doing the same stuff. And so something's got to change. I'm putting in this bishop who is now going to move this to a different phase. And I think it's the same for bishop, stake president, like every calling in the church, all the way up to president of the church. There's a time and season for everything. And so just because, we have different styles of leadership, we have different things that take place under different presidencies, it's not that there's something wrong. It's just, it's the next phase. And this is what needs to be done now. And that person was specifically prepared for whatever the thing is that the Lord is directing. So it's going to be interesting to see what President Oak's presidency is like. I'm very, very, very curious. You think about President Nelson and you think about everything that he's focused on. You think about the different terms and phrases and stuff that he coined, like gathering scattered Israel, higher, holier. His focus on Hebrew words like Hesed. And then, just the things that made his presidency unique. What is President Oak's presidency going to look like? I don't know. We're moving into uncharted territory, essentially. And it's going to be really interesting. And I'm going to be spending a lot of time going back through his talks now that he's president of the church, see what he's said in the past, and pay attention to what his priorities are now. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's certain patterns or just interesting things that we notice. It's just it's like, I don't know about you. I guess it depends on how old you are, but it feels like President Monson's presidency was like a lifetime ago. It feels like it was a lifetime ago. And President Hinckley's even further back. And then President Benson's even further back. I really only remember President Hinckley, President Monson, and President Nelson. Those are like the only three that I really remember in my life. Because before that, I was just too young. So this is a big transition for me. And it's kind of mind-blowing. But I know that the Lord is in charge, and I know that good things are ahead. And I know that the second coming is ahead. And I think that it's going to happen sooner than later. But, okay. Well, that's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.